it's quite like at least a 10-second delay. It's a little disturbing. In any case, if you didn't have enough skippers last month, there's plenty more to go. Last month was early flying skippers, an hour into those that start flying a little later, starting around June, been progressing through the summer to the latest arrivals. These are, again, if anybody's not local, these are New Jersey skippers. So we have 30 plus to deal with, and that's more than enough for most of us, because skippers can be fairly intimidating. I again want to emphasize that I did not develop all these identification characteristics that I'm going to discuss. They're based on Jeff's field guides and Rick Check and Guy Tudor's Butterflies of the East Coast, which is a gold mine of more specific, more detailed information, and highly recommended for anybody who wants to dive a little deeper into butterfly biology. And also I want to, this is slow. Oh man.
Does everyone see the screen with the photographers?
Here we go.
Yeah.
Yes, we do.
And now, so once again, I do want to thank all our club members and many friends who contributed photographs to this, without which it wouldn't be possible to have an pretty much all NABA program. And also to remind people, if you're not photographing butterflies, it's really a lot of fun, and it's a great help for identification. You don't have to do every ID in the field. You can take your photographs, come home, and use field guides and other reference material at your leisure. So if you're not photographing yet, it's definitely something you should think of. And once again, just really briefly going over the topography of a skipper. Why is it a grass skipper? It has an unusual resting pose with forewings at 45-degree angle and the hind wings flat, unlike most other butterflies, which are either closed or fully open. It has little spatulate antenna club with a little hook at the end, whereas most butterflies have a club-like antenna tip. Skippers have a long abdomen and short wings compared to many other butterflies. The males of many species have a stigma crower wing, which can be helpful in identification. They are almost exclusively grass and sedge feeders, which is not an identification thing, although it does feed into the habitat where you may be seeing.
Caterpillars.
Yeah, okay. Wade is reminding me to say that it's the larvae that are feeding on the grasses and sedges, but the adults, like most butterflies, feed on liquid refreshment, nectar, or other delightful substances. Now, I just want to remind folks of the importance of the cell, which is a area of the wing defined by venation. It's an open area, and frequently there are spots in the cell that may be useful for identification. And we'll be talking about the costa, the edge of the wing, the bracelets, which are these little series of spots toward the tip of the wing. Sometimes the color of the fringes is important. So there are a number of things that will be repeated in terms of using them for the identification of these little critters. And I didn't emphasize it much the last time, but when you're in the field looking at a skipper, things you should find, not only what it looks like, and there are many aspects to what it looks like, but what time of year it is. Is this butterfly likely to be flying at the time I'm here out in the field? Where am I? Is this a butterfly that occurs in New Jersey? Does it occur in this part of New Jersey where I'm standing today? Is it likely to be in the habitat where I'm standing today? So after you get a little experience at this, all these things are integrating in your mind sort of automatically. And you may not know every detail. I don't remember every detail of flight periods and ranges necessarily, but I have a general idea of which butterflies are flying when and where they are likely to be found. And that's very useful to develop. So we'll start with salt marsh skipper, something from South Jersey. This occurs in and near salt marshes in the coastal counties south of Ocean, including the Delaware Bay shore. This is a very distinctive species, very long wings, very distinctive yellowish brown color, and a really nice diagnostic bar in the hind wing that no other skipper has. And so if you see that, you're almost certain you're looking at a salt marsh skipper. The sexes are similar above. They have, like many, many skippers, a transverse spot band across the forewing. And this is a cell spot. This is the cell that I mentioned before, is sort of an oval area here. And this is a mid-cell spot. If you're looking at the hind wing, you'll see a mirror of the ventral mark on the hind wing from above. So salt marsh, and of course you're probably standing in, near, or in the general vicinity of salt marsh, because like many butterflies of any kind, skippers will stray to a certain extent from their primary habitat. If there's a very tempting garden nearby or a flowery meadow near that salt marsh, you could very likely see a salt marsh skipper somewhere nearby. So that's something always to keep in mind. These things fly, and so they are not strictly confined to their habitats necessarily, some more than others. Another South Jersey species associated with salt marshes is Arran skipper. The male and female are similar below, kind of a little bit nondescript. It's yellowish brown and just this palish ray through the hind wing. It's rather ill-defined. But again, you're in South Jersey, you're in the general vicinity of a salt marsh. This is not a distinctive bar through the hind wing like in the salt marsh skipper. Seems like a pretty good bet under those circumstances. Above, however, the male and female are different. Take a look at that in a second. Here we go. The male does have a stigma, but it's really hard to see. It has a big orange field in the hind wing, but this little gray stigma is, not a major mark. It's unless you're close and you've got good binoculars, you're not going to see it probably. But this bird head mark toward the tip of the forewing is very distinctive. Here's the eye of the bird. Here's the beak of the bird pointing toward the butterfly's head. And that certainly jumps out at you if you know what to look for. The female also has a bird head mark, but she has not quite as much orange in the wings, the hind wings and forewings, and there are very dark veins crossing both wings. So they're fairly similar, and usually doesn't really matter which one of the two you're identifying. So you can be just happy that it's an Arran skipper. Now, Delaware is something we're going to see up here. This occurs throughout New Jersey. This is going to be coming out in early June and flying through the summer. Nothing like a fresh Delaware skipper. A beautiful, bright, kind of perky looking butterfly, maybe because it's so bright orange. Nothing else quite looks like that. The male and female, again, are similar, unmarked essentially underneath. Orange fringes on the wing help to separate it from some other species that we will mention. Some people get confused with European skipper, which is coming up shortly. Here we go. European is never as bright orange as a fresh Delaware. Now, of course, Delawares wear, and they're not quite as brilliant after a week or two out there, but they're never going to look as dull as particularly a European, which has this gray overscaling. And Wade pointed out something to me today, which I just hadn't really noticed. Europeans are really hairy. Look at the hairiness of the head and the back and the body. When you see it from above on the back of the abdomen, much different from a Delaware skipper, which is quite trim. So that's another method of telling them apart, is hirsuteness. Now above, Delaware, in contrast to being unmarked below. Delawares have very helpful markings above. The male has, they're both basically orange on both wings. Excuse me. The male has this, I call it an angled mark, but some references call it a harpoon. Like this is the barb of the harpoon here.
Yeah, you got any jigsaw puzzles laying around that are recent?
What?
Do
I
you have any
can't hear
jigsaw puzzles around left that
whoever's talking. I
No.
can't hear you.
if they gotta go up in the attic to figure out
Sharon, this
moldy
is
and
Jen.
goody?
Unfortunately,
Where'd
when
you
I
put the other one?
uh,
When
Eileen,
When you're finished.
Mailer, can you
Yeah.
hear me? I need you to mute yourself, please.
It's going back to her.
What?
It's going back to
Sharon,
Donna.
so if you go to your participants, right, move your mouse, you'll see the big green bar that says you
Yeah.
are sharing your screen.
Yeah, go to participants.
Yeah, participants,
Okay.
and you should be able to mute her. I
Hello?
apologize. I had sent her a message earlier asking her to mute herself when she'd logged on. There you go.
Where?
Well, I guess she's muted
She,
herself.
yeah, she just muted herself.
Okay,
Okay.
right. Uh,
Back to business.
Back to the male Delaware. He has this harpoon mark with very distinct dark radiating veins, which distinguishes him from a couple of other things we'll see later, also into this wide dark border. The female has a really distinctive mark in the forewing, this large black patch, and this may look either like one or two little spots right in the middle of the dark patch. Some people describe it as looking like snow. That works for you, that's good. And she also has dark radiating veins going out toward the tip of the hind wing. So above Delaware and below too, Delawares are pretty distinctive. They're found pretty much throughout New Jersey. One brood in the north, two broods in the south. Sometimes we see them in September on our Cape May trips. Two-spotted, unfortunately not nearly as common as Delaware Skipper. This doesn't really have any reliable place to find it. It's apparently not at Parker Preserve anymore, and Lakehurst, used to be at Lakehurst, and not there anymore. So this one seems precarious. But if you do see one, it's really distinctive. It's yellow-orange, but not as bright as a Delaware, but it's got this really distinctive white bar along the bottom edge of the hind wing. Nothing else looks anything like that. Above, male has a rather crooked looking stigma and this big dark patch that joins the hind wing, the forewing border. The female is much darker, and like many female skippers, she has a row of pale spots across the forewing, 2 to 3, and her hind wing may be marked, unmarked, or rather tawny looking. But again, this is a species that occurs when it occurs in acid bogs. So that one is habitat restricted. You're not going to see it very far from a bog if you're lucky enough to find one. Dotted skipper is another species that is in the same general area, was in the same general area as two-spotted, but this is a species of dry habitats. The larvae feed on panic grasses in dry uplands on the coastal plain. Fairly distinctive, but as you can see, it's variable. I put several in here showing the difference in color and prominence of the spots. The female normally has larger, more prominent spots than the male, as you can see between these two. And usually there are a couple of projecting spots here out of the chevron, and you can usually see 2 forewing spots. You see them here, you see them here, you see them here. Another characteristic is the fringes are dark on the forewing and light on the hind wing, but of these 3, this is the only one, Chris's photo, that really shows it. Here's the dark fringes here, lighter fringes here. Now, the last time I was anyway, at Parker Preserve, we were debating over a crossline skipper, or a skipper, whether it was crossline or two-spotted, because the chevron pattern is a little similar, but crossline does not show those four wing spots below. So that's, and the fringes are the same color. So, but this is another one that is becoming increasingly scarce and difficult to find. Here it is above. Good. Male has a, like many skippers, it has a easily visible stigma in an orange field. As the two spots are visible above as well as below. And the ventral spot pattern, whatever it is, shows on the hind wing above in both sexes. I think it's Czech speculates that the name dotted may come from all the spots on the female dotted skipper above. She has 8 to 10 pale spots. There are cell spots, there's a bracelet, there's the two outer spots, and there's a series of 3 or so across the forewing. So she's considerably different from the male. And he speculates that those spots are the source of the name, but nobody really knows. But we're hoping that dotted skipper isn't disappearing. Collier's Mills was a good place, hopefully still is a place to see it. In contrast to the scarce ones, here's our pretty common northern broken dash. One of the duller skippers, but luckily usually easily identifiable unless it gets really warm. The color is usually fairly dull, brownish yellow, yellowish brown. And if and you're looking at its left side, you see a mark usually in the shape of a 3. Now that can be variably prominent. Some are not terrifically well marked, or when they get worn, the mark may be difficult to see, but you can usually make out enough of it to say, yeah, I'm pretty sure that's a broken dash. It has a pretty long flight period from mid-June to September, so it's with us for quite a long time. Now above, here's where the name comes from. The male has a stigma that is in 2 parts. There's a dot or one portion near the body, then there's a patch in the center that's not composed of stigmatic tissue, not that you can see that, but trust me. And then there's another stigmatic portion out here. So that's the broken dash. The stigma is broken into 2 parts. And then he's one of a group of male skippers that has doesn't have a big orange field around the stigma, but has a little rectangular orange spot at the end. Sometimes that's called a keyhole spot. And we'll see that on others. Probably have seen on others the last time. And the hind wings, not really marked, but sometimes has some paler center to it. The female, mostly marked by these yellowish spots across the forewing. Generally yellow, or sometimes Jeff describes this as an orange spot. This one spot is distinctive because it's elongated, rectangular, and usually I think of them as rather yellowish rather than white, as in some species. And sometimes she has more or less color on the costa. And broken dash, pretty common throughout the state, maybe a little less common on the coastal plain, in and near moist habitats usually, but that wanders to all kinds of flowery habitats, including gardens. Now, the several species in some of the field guides are called the witches. Sometimes that refers just to the females, sometimes to the males and females. A group that's considered difficult to identify, to separate from one another, because they're all kind of little brown jobs. But really, they're not that bad. The same we had done the last time in Little Glassy Wing too. Relatively easy, done sometimes has no markings or else a really faint marking below. Little Glassy Wing has a crescent below, but it always has this little bit of an odd pair of spots right in the middle that just looks sort of out of place. It's not a smooth crescent, and also has this spot up here near the costa sometimes. And often most helpful is the white under the antennal club, not part of the wing decoration at all. And of course, as we just saw, a broken dash, if you get one that's well marked, you have a nice 3 to look at. And the above shots are fairly easy. Done male usually has almost nothing above, totally dark brown. The female has 2 little spots above, so not as flashy as, say, little glassy wing, where both the male and female have large glassy spots above. The male spot, the center spot there is sort of rectangular and it's angled over, whereas the females is large and usually squarish, but although this one is rectangular, and it's oriented more along the plane of the wing, parallel to the costa. And then we just saw a northern broken dash. We have a prominent stigma, keyhole spot in the male, and yellowish transverse spots in the female. So they're really not that bad, but I do remember when Wade and I did our very first Great Swamp count, we went into a meadow and there were like hundreds of skippers in there. They were all dark and we were beginning butterflies and we had no idea what we were doing. So I can't vouch for our report from that count, but we did our best. But once you study them a little bit, you have to put a little time into it. They become a lot less intimidating. Here's one that's easy though, easy. One of our largest skippers, the broad-winged skipper, going to be starting in June and going through the summer into September. This is big. You see broad-wing and you almost just know it by the size. It's large. It has a ray across the hind wing, which is sometimes rather vague. As you can see, I put several in here. It's variable a bit in color. It's usually rather rusty, but if it gets worn, it looks almost entirely different. The ray kind of disappears. Sometimes the spots are very prominent, but the pattern is usually pretty recognizable, and the size alone gives it away. And this is, I find, more or less in the vicinity of common reed stands, but it's big and it's strong and it flies, and we get broadwing a couple times in the summer in our yard, even though the nearest frag is probably half a mile away. Above, it's really easy. Again, you're looking at a big butterfly. It's flashy looking above. My favorite mark is this. I call this a boot, and it's kicking a stone. And that's evident both in the male and the female, whose spots are creamy rather than orange.
Looks like it's putting.
Wade says it looks like a putter and a golf ball. Whatever works for you. That's good. And on the hind wing above, you'll see a bold orange pattern that more or less mirrors the ventral pattern. So broadwing is a pretty easy customer to deal with in the skipper array. So is black dash. Not quite as big as a broadwing, but this is a species you're going to find in the vicinity of sedge marshes. Rather than feeding on grasses, the larvae of black dash feed on sedges, mostly tussock sedge. It's a bright rusty brown when it's fresh, usually brighter and rustier than this. This one's a little bit worn and has a really distinctive chunky mark on the hind wing, which is broadest in the middle, and is pretty much unlike any other mark you're going to see on a skipper. It's kind of something you're going to see in the same habitat as mulberry wing, for example, that we'll get to later. Above, here's the black dash of the name. It has a big, thick stigma across the forewing. And at the end, there's this odd little hook mark, which extends out toward the border of the wing. And another skipper, Dion skipper, looks very similar in the forewing above. The telling mark there is that the hind wing, which you unfortunately can't see here, mirrors the chunky mark that you can see from below, whereas Dion's mirrors its simple dash, and we'll see that a little later. The female is a typical dark female with an array of very bold transverse spots across the hind wing. And so given that lots of females look a lot like this, The giveaway here is going to be the hind wing, which has the chunk on it that you can see from below. So black dash is something that's sort of locally common when you find a good sedge marsh, but you don't find it in every wetland you come across. Ocola skipper, I put it in here, but you're really unlikely to see an Ocola skipper. We haven't found one in the last few years up in Marsh County, where there was a very small population. But it's similar, we'll go quickly, similar to Delaware, but not as bright below, and it has pale veins that are pretty distinctive when you see it in the field, and white fringes that are very distinctive, at least until they might wear off. Now, getting an above look at a Delaware is a challenge because they rarely open their wings at an Orogos, unlike Delaware. I had to import this shot of the male from a very cooperative NABA member in Colorado. Unlike Delaware's, which have a lot of markings above in the orange patch of the forewing, Orogos has almost nothing. Maybe a male has just a little faint cell end mark, no stigma. And the female has a stigma-like mark, unlike the male. It's not, of course, not a stigma, but it's a dark patch. Jeff describes it as needle-like and very thin, but this one is not. And Marianne, who sees more of them out where she is, agrees that they mostly look like this. But Orogos, I said we had in Morris County in North Jersey. There are two populations. North Jersey with a remnant in Morris County that was in dry fields with little blue stem, but just seems to be gone. And the southern population was on Joint Base McGuire-Dix Lakehurst, and that was in wet savannas, considerably different. But we don't know the status of that population because the Army does not want us to know. Another one in the same category with Delaware and Orogos is rare skipper, South Jersey, Burlington County, may be locally common near brackish marshes with, or fresh marshes with tall cordgrass, which is the larval food plant. It's big, it's bigger than Delaware. Can be bright orange. This one I believe is a little worn. I've never seen a rare skipper, so I'm just going by what other people say. But this has grayish fringes, unlike Delaware that has orange fringes, and Orogos, which has white fringes. Above, somewhat similar to Delaware, the male, it has that harpoon mark, but it lacks those really distinctive radiating veins. There's a suggestion here, but much less conspicuous. But a really good mark is that white rings circle the abdomen. Delaware does not have that. And these female also shows at least pale rings. She is quite large, larger than the male and much larger than a Delaware skipper. And somewhat similar above, but much less orange. And her snowshoe patch here extends all the way to this hindwing border. I forgot to mention that in Delaware, the patch doesn't reach the border down here. It gets into the radiating veins. So rare skipper, pretty much easy to tell from Delaware if you're lucky enough to see one. Every year I say this is the year I'm going to see rare skipper, so still trying. We shall see. Now we're getting back to North Jersey.
Oh, this is all over.
Yeah, no, not really. Oh, this is getting really slow. Okay, good. Here's Mulberry Wing, one of my favorites. We actually have them in our yard most years. This is another sedge feeder, so you're going to find it near nice tussock sedge wetlands. Bright rusty brown above and really unmistakable. And this mark in the forewing, hindwing, excuse me, either looks like an airplane to some folks or like the state of Texas to some folks. You can take your pick. but it's pretty distinctive. It's much bolder than the mark on a black dash, for example. It's more of a big yellow field. And it shouldn't really be mistaken for a black dash, which does occur in similar habitat, and very different above. The male is completely dark above, might have a little bit of a bracelet there, occasionally a faint spot, but your impression is that it's dark on both. The female, on the other hand, has prominent white spots across the forewing and some in the hindwing as well. So you can see better on this one here. And both, when they're really fresh, have a beautiful purplish sheen above. You have to catch it in just the right light, but that's the source of the name Mulberry Wing. It's a mulberry purple color in a fresh specimen. So one of our really cutest little butterflies. And moving on to another marshy inhabitant is Dion Skipper. This is another bright rusty colored skipper with a mark in the hind wing, but this is simply two rays, a bolder ray across the middle and a much weaker ray that parallels the lower edge of the hind wing. So we have black dash, which has a chunky mark, mulberry wing that has an airplane mark, and Dion Skipper, which simply has two rays across the hind wing of a bright rusty both wings. So they are easy to tell. And this one is much less common than the others. Here's where Dion Skipper looks a little bit like a black dash above. It's got a prominent stigma, although not as thick as a black dash. And it's got a very similar hook mark at the end. So here's where you're looking at the hind wing to tell them apart. Black dash has a chunky mark that mirrors the ventral, and Dion Skipper just has the ray, mostly the one ray. And oh yeah, Dion is also noticeably bigger than a black dash. The female is quite lovely. She's got this beautiful pattern of sort of, I don't know, to me these look like little rocket ships across the forewing. And also has the stripe mirroring the ventral side. And here is black dash for comparison with Dion. The wing shape seems to, at least in these two photos, seems much different also. Dion seems to be much more pointed in the forewing than black dash. So shouldn't be a big problem to tell those two apart. Now we're getting a little further along, and we are into sachem. This is, excuse me, I need a drink. Sachem is the teaser butterfly that I put in the butterflights because the female not so much, but the male in particular can be very perplexing because it seems to have these vague markings and you really can't make much out of it as a, it can just, if you get to the point where what the heck is this, you got to start to think sachem if you're in midsummer. The male, very vague markings. You can see a little bit, particularly if it gets worn, it's difficult to see the markings, but you can almost always see this little square here that adjoins the bottom edge of the hind wing. It's a little square-ish, darkish mark. Doesn't seem like much, but it's usually there. And have a mystery skipper in midsummer in a field or in your garden even. Sachem is worth thinking about. The female is much more distinctive. She's a bit bigger, has a bold chevron on the hind wing that narrows down to a little narrow mark at the point of the chevron. Sometimes this chevron is quite bold, other times it's a little more obscure. But she also has this squarish mark adjoining the edge of the hind wing. Looking at them above, they're very distinctive. They're not nearly as confusing as they are from below. The male, almost all of us know, male's got this big bold mark in the forewing. It's not all stigma. This part is a stigma, which is sort of club shaped. And then it has a dark patch, which is dark and sometimes gray adjoining that. But your impression is, wow, a big bold black mark in the forewing, which really stands out. Whereas the female has glassy spots through the forewing, adjoining a dark patch that's a little bit like the male's stigma. Both of them have branched veins. You see this V shape? Branched veins in kind of a vague orangey or pale field in the hind wing. So if the forewing markings aren't enough, you can see branched veins in the hind wing to clinch the identification. In sachem, we don't have a lot of sachems up here. They get increasingly uncommon as you go north, but can be very abundant along the coast and far south. And sachem, I forgot to mention, is an immigrant. It's not a resident species. It repopulates us every year from the south, as does fiery skipper. The female looks a little bit like the female sachem. She's rather dull looking and doesn't exactly have a chevron, but there's sort of this pale patch through here, but she has scattered blurry brown spots, and they have these pale areas adjacent to them. And she's, makes her really fairly distinctive. The male is pretty much unmistakable. He's bright yellow all over and has better defined scattered dark spots that do not have the pale follow spots with them. Fiery's pretty unmistakable once you see one of those starting in midsummer. Above, the female has rather bold blocky marks on the forewing, including tawny cell spots. And she has a mark on the hind wing, which it does not mirror anything really on the ventral side, but it looks like an arrow pointing to the rear. I'm sort of outlining it here, which is fairly distinctive. And whereas the male, the thing I usually see, it's got a bold stigma and a patch that's sort of curvy that points toward the forewing apex, but really jagged brown edge, the trailing edges on both forewing and hind wing, very irregular looking, which is between the bottom and the top of male fiery are particularly unmistakable. And this you're going to find in almost any habitat with flowers. Again, that's something that ordinarily we see one or two a year in our garden. And here's something we used to see in our garden and sadly do not anymore. The magnificent Leonard skipper. This is really big for a skipper, although probably not quite as big as a broadwing skipper, but unmistakably below, male and female the same, bright chestnut, sometimes a little darker, with really brilliant bold chevron of spots below and a central spot within the chevron. Above, they're a little tricky to tell apart from each other. I always have to think, but the male has much more orange. It has stigma and a patch across the orange forewing, and there's a band of orange spots down here beyond the stigma. And he has some sort of a mirror of the ventral chevron on the hind wing. The female, on the other hand, is really considerably darker. She doesn't have that orange. She has these dark marks similar to the males, but she doesn't have an orange field like this. She has these blocky marks, and they really stand out on the dark forewing. And also she has some kind of mirror of the chevron below. Now, Leonards, the larvae are blue stem feeders and used to be fairly widespread, but it's in fact, it was in South Jersey. We used to see them on our Cape May trips. Disappeared from South Jersey, almost disappeared. We now have only really 2 spots to see it. one of which luckily we can get into at High Point. The other one is at Yards Creek. So Leonard Skipper is teetering on the edge, unfortunately, for such a magnificent butterfly. And let's get to another immigrant. Pretty soon, we tend to see Ocola overlapping with Leonard's in our yard. We almost always get Ocola in latest summer. Another immigrant that shows up August and may be seen as late as October, particularly in South Jersey. This, like salt marsh skipper, is very elongated in the forewings, project way beyond the hind wings. It's brownish, sometimes with a purplish sheen if it's a female, and pale veins, which are fairly distinctive. Abdominal stripes, that's characteristic of the genus Panaquina, and which salt marsh also has. And sometimes you'll see a faint spot band on an Ocola skipper, maybe unmarked or have a spot band like this photo. The males and females are similar both below and above. They have spots across the forewing, but this one is usually distinctively arrowhead shaped and quite prominent. So with the curring on these really long forewings, it's a really dead giveaway. We always enjoy waiting for the Ocola to show up in our yard every year. We're usually not disappointed. It's been a while since we haven't seen one. And we are going to end with Clouded Skipper, which used to be a fairly regular stray or visitor into extreme South Jersey in late summer, but it's become increasingly uncommon. And it's last time when we were down there on a Cape May trip, it was quite an event to see one in Cape May Point State Park. But it's a beautiful little skipper. Very distinctively marked below. When it's fresh, it has what I call a tornado funnel in the middle of the hind wing below, and the clouds are surrounding the tornado funnel. So it's almost unmistakable and has this bold bracelet and white dashes along the costa, but I don't ever remember noticing those dashes as a field mark. You kind of always look at the hind wing. When it gets worn, however, it's not quite as spectacular, but almost always you can see the contrast between the tornado funnel and the clouds that surround it. Even on a pretty, because this is the one I think from that we saw, at Cape May a couple of years ago. Above, clouded is not a whole lot to get excited about. The male has very few markings above, small bracelet and maybe a cell spot. The female has more prominent spots. Sometimes there's the cell spot in the female. So it's much more distinctive below. As you can see, we have an awful lot of skippers that are giving you a series of transverse spots across the forewing. So it does take a little studying to tell them apart, but I've come up with something to help you. People who saw the last version of Skippers, Tops 10 in 2010, may remember that there was a handout. I made up a series of field sheets just showing skippers above, because the original program was just skipper tops. And so I made a field sheet to go with it. And I've updated it with all the latest and greatest information and all NABA photos. And hopefully this will, excuse me, soon be available on our website for download. We now have no copyright problems since these are all now NABA photos. So I hope this overview has helped you and lessened the intimidation a little. I hope it hasn't increased it. But I am, if you have, I'd be happy to answer them now.
You have to turn it over.
Oh, I have to turn it over to
Yep.
stop sharing.
Hi. So
Okay.
yes. So